I'll hand over to Jenny Randles now, who will guide us through the story of this extraordinary incident. We'll hand over to you, Jenny.
All right, thanks very much. Yes, we'll proceed as fast as possible because there is an awful lot to get through. I know that everybody who's going to be talking tonight is going to want to speak for a lot longer than we're probably going to have opportunity to talk for. And I'm sure there are going to be thousands of questions that you will all want to ask. So I'm going to do my bit by giving you as brief a synopsis as I possibly can of this, as Bob said, extraordinary case. I will stress right at the beginning that I haven't got any axe to grind about this case at all. I'm not trying to prove to you that anything happened, that there was a UFO involved at all, or that there wasn't a UFO involved. My job as coordinator of investigations for BUFORA is simply to respond to anything that looks worthwhile responding to and trying to ensure that some sort of adequate investigation is carried out. And hopefully, within our limitations, that's what's happened on this occasion. Just how close we've managed to get to the truth about what happened on those nights in 1980 remains to be seen. But we will proceed and see how far we get. And I will also stress that I am quite happy if the outcome of all the investigation and research, maybe even tonight or certainly in the future, when this case can finally be laid to rest, if it ever can finally be laid to rest, shows that what occurred was a simple misidentification of something or other, or a combination of something or others, then I shall be perfectly happy to say so and shout it from the rooftops. I have certainly got no vested interest in proving that there's something strange happened here. Okay, well, what we're actually talking about is a strange series of events that began as a series of rumours back in the very first few days of 1981. It's a series of rumours that have escalated over the past 2 or 3 months into a worldwide press sensation. Which might make some of you, and I know it does make some of you because I've had this put to me this evening, believe that this case has only just happened or has only just been discovered or whatever. That isn't true. The press publicity post-dates the events by quite some time. My first indication personally of what occurred was in the early days of February 1981. So we're talking about almost 3 years ago now, when Paul Begg, who is a writer of books about the paranormal, who lives, or at the time lived, in the East Anglia area, phoned me about a conversation he'd had with a loose acquaintance in a village pub who had told him that he was a civilian employed as a radar operator at an RAF/civilian joint radar base in Norfolk. And he claimed, this radar operator, that although he hadn't personally been involved, he had heard from colleagues who were there at the time on duty that something strange had happened, he thought, on the night of December the 29th to December the 30th, 1980. So that is about 4 or 5, 6 weeks previous to when I was being told this. And the claim was that they had tracked an unidentified target on their radar screen coming over the coast somewhere around about Norwich, and heading southwards in the vicinity of wooded area to the southeast of Ipswich, whereupon they lost the target from their screens. They followed the usual procedures, reported it through the channels, and really left it at that, because this happens not every day of the week, but does happen quite often. And so they didn't think anything particularly unusual about it, and probably wouldn't have made any comments whatsoever about this, but for the fact that 2 or 3 days later, allegedly, so we're now talking about either New Year's Day or thereabouts, 1981, some US Air Force, and I stress that because this was an RAF base, no US Air Force involvement at all, some US Air Force intelligence officers had come along and taken away the radar recordings of that particular night, and in so doing had imparted a fantastic story about why they wanted these radar recordings. And that was that the object that they thought they might have tracked had actually landed in a forest near to an RAF US Air Force base, Bentwaters and Woodbridge. It's a joint base about 10 miles from Ipswich. There are sort of 2 bases very close to one another, and they, although it is technically owned by the RAF, it is leased by the RAF to the US Air Force and is staffed by US Air Force officers. And it is claimed that this object came down in the woods just outside the perimeter of the base, that it was a structured craft, so the radar operators were told, and that people from the base went out in pursuit of it, and in a jeep, and the jeep's engine and lights cut out at that point. And there then proceeded, supposedly, a request back to the base for assistance, at which point high-ranking officers, including, it was said, the base commander from the base, came out and proceeded to have some sort of a close encounter with this UFO that was on the ground for several hours, supposedly damaged. And the base commander and the base commander alone approached it closely and had a protracted conversation with entities, aliens, for want of a better word, who were seen in direct association with the craft, suspended underneath it. And that was the gist of the story. Fantastic, of course, uncorroborated. All the attempts that we made to corroborate this, both by Paul Begg, myself, and other people who were working with us, direct to the radar base in question, met with a complete blank denial, that they had no information about this event at all. So at that point, I would have been forgiven. Maybe it was an error of judgment, I don't know, but certainly I regarded it as an unprovable rumour which couldn't be taken any further. We did what we could and left it at that. But within a few days, events were to transpire which changed the whole complexion of this, because it was found that two independent, separate things had occurred. Number one, Norman Oliver, who is well known to long-standing members of BUFORA as a former editor of its journal, and more recently has been involved in the British UFO Society, had received communication from an American investigator who he was in friendly contact with, to say that someone had gone back to America and had reported that something quite extraordinary had happened in the vicinity of this US Air Force base in East Anglia. And the gist of the conversation was that over the period between just after Christmas and New Year 1981, approximately 8 contacts involving radar trackings, involving photographs, involving alleged landings and contacts with military personnel had all happened in the vicinity of this base. And other details came out allegedly concerning radiation traces that were left in the wake, and so on. That was number one. And episode number 2, and all of these 3 things, my story, that story, and this one I'm about to relate, were totally independent. None of the people involved in any of these different facets knew what was going on in the other facet. And by the procedures of following the channels, linking those two together and going through to our investigations coordinator in the region and me saying, hey, I've got a great story for you, I don't know whether you can do anything about it, but see what you can find out, I was then told, and found that Dot Street, who is our local BUFORA investigator in that particular area, I say local, although she in fact lives about 30 miles north of the forest, had, in conjunction with a colleague of hers, Brenda Butler, both of whom are here tonight and will be talking to you later, been pursuing this incident since it had happened. They in fact had discovered it from a trusted contact on the base, a military officer from the US Air Force on the base, within a couple of days of the event. And the story that they were told by this person, who claims that he was directly involved and was actually one of the people who went out to the object when it was on the ground, was more or less identical to what we had got through the radar operators. And it matched a lot of the details from the American source too. So all these things seemed to coalesce, and although obviously we had a whole series of uncorroborated, unprovable rumours, and we recognised that and did not try to make too much out of it, it was perfectly evident that something was going on, and that there was presumably some substance behind these stories, that something had triggered them off. And so, much to their credit, Brenda and Dot tenaciously followed up this investigation on site, and did, I think, everything that could have been expected of them within the limitations that they obviously faced. I mean, travelling into this area is difficult. Although Brenda lives a little bit closer than Dot, she is still some way away from where this occurred. And of course, you've got the problems of military secrecy and so on, and people not really wanting to talk about this, and those who did talk being frightened that they could get in trouble for having talked, and so on. They did what they could. One of the first things that they did was that they actually went along to the base and tried to talk to the person in charge. Now, because this is both an RAF and a US Air Force base, there is a sort of landlord, a British base commander, who is it right, he's a squadron leader? Or, yes, a squadron leader, who is in charge as a sort of tenant for the base. And there is also an American base commander and a chain of command under him. Now, they got to see, this is again still in February 1981, within less than 2 months of the events, they got to see the British base commander and talk to him about the events. He was not particularly forthcoming, but he certainly didn't deny that the incidents had happened. He basically told them that they would have to go to the Ministry of Defence. That was the only route that they could take to get any information out about UFO incidents that had occurred, which is, of course, what they did. They wrote to the Ministry of Defence. The Ministry of Defence sent back a typically non-committal response. They subsequently followed this up by phone conversations in which, at least on one occasion, the Ministry of Defence flatly denied that the incident had occurred and that they had any records whatsoever appertaining to UFO events at that time. And they also proceeded to look for civilian witnesses in and around the area. And they found a number of civilians, farmers, villagers, and others, who had allegedly seen something in and around that time which seemed to correlate with the same sort of events that we were talking about. So we had now not just several military people who'd been talking about what had happened, the radar story, but also civilians now saying, yes, this had happened. And by sort of piecing together the different bits of the story, extracting them from all the different accounts, you could just about make up a sort of consensus opinion about what had occurred. But it was difficult, and there was a good reason why it was difficult, but we didn't realise it at the time. We, of course, all along were working on the presumption that we were dealing with one sighting. Even though the American person had talked about a series of 8 incidents over that space of time, we assumed that there was one key major incident which involved these security patrol officers going out, seeing something on the ground, and so on. And we didn't realise that the reason why we were getting certain conflicting testimony may have been because certain people were describing not the same event, but a different one. So Brenda and Dot proceeded very slowly and cautiously and using whatever tactics they could to chase up every conceivable lead. I'll let them describe in more detail precisely what they think now the actual story is that you can sort of distill out of all of this testimony. But as I understand it, it appears to be that, just as was originally described, something was seen to come down into the forest. It was originally witnessed by a farmer who saw this thing coming down, and he called the base, although of course the base already knew about this because they had a security patrol on one of the gates who had seen it. They radioed for permission to go out to investigate. They went into the woods about half a mile from the gate and allegedly saw this object on the ground. What happens from that point onwards is what begins to become confusing, because we have testimony from several different sources that, yes, indeed, there were aliens floating around, suspended in shafts of light underneath it. Yes, indeed, the base commander did talk to these aliens. And yes, indeed, the craft was supposedly damaged and it eventually was repaired and took off. We have others who say that that didn't happen and that all that really occurred was that this thing flew around the forest. But we do have consistent testimony from a number of sources that in its wake allegedly were left indentations, that is, marks in the ground in a triangular pattern, and radiation that was in association with these triangular holes and in association with the trees immediately around the area. Also from several independent sources that the trees were damaged when the object left. It actually damaged the tops of the trees. And from several sources too that when it came down, supposedly it hit one of the trees and damaged the base of the tree. And that sort of is a very basic description of the event. I mean, it's filled out enormously by some of the witnesses, and I think it's probably quite clear that some of the witnesses are elaborating to the point of fantasy on what probably happened. Indeed, it's quite conceivable that some of the people who have talked over the course of the 3 years in the extensive attempts that people have made to find these witnesses have not really been reporting first-hand testimony at all, but have simply been relating the stories that must have spread around the base immediately after it had happened, and are now describing them as if they were involved, because it's far more exciting to claim that you were actually there than to say, well, so-and-so told me this, or I heard it in the bar one night, or whatever. And there is certainly an element of that within the descriptions of what occurred. That's my opinion. I mean, it may not be the opinion of other people, but I would think that that is highly suggested by the facts of the matter. Well, whilst Brenda and Dot were pursuing all these various avenues, there was relatively little I could do, of course, 250 miles away. But what I did do was try to pursue the government angle, because if this incident had happened, so I surmised, in the vicinity of a military air base like this, then surely somebody must have done some sort of investigation. I mean, the Ministry of Defence are always telling us that they only investigate UFO events from the point of view of whether or not they have any defence implications. Well, if anything is going to have defence implications, it must have been this case. I mean, we're talking about a supposed craft seen by military personnel coming down right next to a strategic air base, supposedly leaving marks in the ground and radiation and goodness knows what. I mean, it would be very difficult for anybody to deny that that has potential defence implications. But all the attempts that I made to get any information out of our Ministry of Defence proved totally fruitless. It's not uncommon. I mean, they would use several different excuses. Most of the time they would simply ignore my questions and answer something else totally different in the letter that replied. Other times, for most of 1982, for example, they blamed the situation down in the Falkland Islands for why they couldn't be bothered dealing with UFO questions, which may be a genuine reason, but it was certainly a very handy excuse anyway. And then strange things happened at the end of last year, when I suddenly got a letter from the Ministry of Defence saying that they had reached a decision and that they were going to release the UFO files that they held in their possession, and that the only thing that remained to be decided now was exactly how they were going to do this. They were currently deciding the best means to publish all of this information. Exciting news, you might think. It's not quite as exciting as it sounds when you actually see the UFO data that they claim to have. A few little scraps of paper with one-word answers on, like yes, no, 1,000 feet, a red light. And that's the sum total of their case reports. And they claim they have about 15,000 of those on record. And that because it's going to take ages and ages and ages to actually physically publish all of this, this is why it's still a year later. They still haven't produced this data. But at least it was progress, it was a step forward, and obviously, I mean, I'm not trying to claim that they're hiding anything, and if they want to say that they're not hiding anything, then the best thing for them to do is to try and make this available in whatever format they can, and with whatever limitations they've got because of financial restrictions. Of course, we all understand that in this day and age. But then, although that wasn't directly relevant to this case, I used that suggestion that they were about to release the data to make renewed efforts to positively ask for any information they had on this specific case. And after a couple of sidetracks onto other issues and the same old story, in April of this year, I was sort of bowled over backwards to suddenly get a letter from the Ministry of Defence saying, oh yes, we do have records that show that unusual lights were seen outside the perimeter of the base on December the 27th. Now that was the date they used, and that was interesting because although we got dates varying between December the 27th and December the 30th from most of the witnesses, the 30th was the one that we centred on mostly because that was the date that seemed to correlate with the radar tracking. But they said December the 27th, they had these unusual lights, they were seen by US Air Force personnel, and that no explanation for these events was ever forthcoming, and that there was no question, because this had been suggested in efforts by the various investigators involved to find a rational explanation for what had gone on, that there was no question that they were trying to use the UFO story as a cover for, say, a crashed aircraft or a testing of some sort of secret experiment. There was no question, the Ministry of Defence said, that that was what happened. It didn't. This was, as far as they were concerned, a UFO event which remains unexplained. So that was certainly an interesting letter, because you're not used to getting such forthcomingness out of the Ministry of Defence. In one sort of short paragraph, they'd said about 5 things that you probably would have struggled for years to get out of them on any other occasion. So it seemed to underline this new policy about becoming more open with us. So that was the position at that point, which taking us to about April of this year. At last, some sort of an official breakthrough. I'll backtrack slightly in the sense that whilst we were going through the periods of frustration, getting nowhere, getting no official confirmation, and Brenda and Dot bashing their heads against a wall of witness after witness who are talking but not being terribly helpful because they're scared about the secrecy of it all, the official witnesses, and the civilian ones not really knowing because they're watching from the outside and are just relating what they saw, but they can't really tell you precisely what went on the base and so on. We decided to try and bring fresh faces into the situation. I asked the Swindon UFO investigation team to visit the area and see if they could reappraise the situation from an outside point of view, in case it was so that Brenda, Dot and myself, to a point from being involved, had sort of been involved in this case for so long that we were sort of missing obvious things because of our over-involvement. So they went along, and they were restricted in what they can do. I must stress this. I mean, they didn't go along and investigate the case or re-investigate the case. They went along to do several specific things, and they were restricted in what they could do. They were there for just a couple of days, and they couldn't get, or Brenda and Dot couldn't persuade any of the military witnesses to talk to them, partly because most of them who had been directly involved had been shipped back to America almost immediately it had happened. And partly because, of course, they were frightened about talking, and they couldn't even find, I don't think, any direct civilian witnesses at that point, although I think Brenda and Dot subsequently have got people who are prepared to talk, who've come out. So all they really could do was evaluate the peripheral side of the sighting, some of the little anomalies that had been attached onto it, like one farmer who claimed that he'd had some strange visitors at one point immediately after the sighting, who'd been asking questions about the case, and sort of MIB connotations had been read into that, and someone in the area who had claimed that their television set had started playing up and acting funny at the time when the events occurred, and so on. And they visited the site and looked at the area where, soon after the incident, the site where the events had occurred had been levelled. The trees that were there had been taken away by the Forestry Commission as part of a routine clearing process that was going on when the events took place. So I'll let them say anything that they want to say in a minute about what happened, if they feel that they have anything useful to contribute on what they discovered in their evaluation, which took place in the summer of 1982. We're moving on back again now into the summer of this year. We've now got the slight breakthrough from the British Ministry of Defence, but we're still really not getting very far other than that. But at the same time as we got this document out of our country, over in America, things started to happen there. Some American researchers for an organisation called CAUSE, which is a sort of team of investigators over there who have been fighting the US government under the Freedom of Information Act, which is an act that they brought in several years ago, which means that the US government now have to justify the keeping secret of any documents. They can't just keep them secret for the sake of it. They either have to release them or explain why they're not going to release them. So using that act, they've been trying to force out relevant UFO material. And they had been approached by a witness who claimed that he had been involved in these events and described a story which was similar to what we knew. But I stress that this was after some of the material of the case had been published in the UFO literature. So you have to bear in mind that it certainly is possible that this particular individual had come across that and therefore elaborated and fantasized a story based on that. We're not saying that that's what happened, but it's certainly something you have to bear in mind in view of the chronology of the events.
Sorry, do you mean Art Wallace?
Yes, we're talking about Art Wallace, which is the pseudonym that's been given to this particular person. He claims to have been an airman who was on the base at the time, and checks that have been made have indicated that Art Wallace, and we know who his real name is, was actually on the base at the time. But other sources, who we have reason to rely upon, seem to say that this particular person wasn't involved in the incident, that he perhaps heard what had happened from sources there and is fantasizing. But you sort of pay your money and take your choice on that at the moment. It's a very controversial thing. But certainly I would stress that the case doesn't rely on Art Wallace's testimony. If it did, it would be far more suspect than it really is. But whatever the value or probative nature of Art Wallace's testimony, Cause in America obviously got excited about this case, thinking we've got a terrific case here, and they used his story and then what they picked up from Britain after they realised, something's gone on over there, let's see what we can find out, and they got in contact with us. They used the information to push the American government for Freedom of Information documents. And after writing to countless sources, I think they were as surprised as I was to get my letter out of the Ministry of Defence, to firstly get a letter from the US Air Force basically saying more or less what the Ministry of Defence said to me, but in much more restrained terms, simply saying, yes, something unusual happened in the vicinity of the airbase, and so on, but we didn't investigate it. And then, through the Freedom of Information Act in June of this year, getting this particular document, which they regard, Cause, as the most significant document that they have got out from the US government. It is, in fact, a memo written by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt, who at the time, in December 1980, was the deputy base commander at the base. And he sets out in 3 paragraphs essentially what happened, based on, so he says, and so he's told us in subsequent conversations, based on the investigation of the events that he did personally and presumably colleagues at the time. Paragraph 1 describes...
Read it out word for word. I feel you should.
Okay, if that, okay, I'll read it out word for word. It's headed Unexplained Lights, and it's dated 13th of January 1981. It's available for anybody to look at afterwards. 13th of January 1981. Bear that date in mind, because we're talking about events that happened 2 weeks earlier. So there is a reason, obviously, why this memo is written 2 weeks late. It's headed to RAF/CC. And we do know that this memo was in fact sent to our Ministry of Defence on the instructions of the British base commander, the person to whom Brenda and Dot went to see about 3 weeks after this was written. Paragraph 1. Early in the morning of 27th of December 1980, approximately 0300 hours, 2 US Air Force security police patrolmen saw unusual lights outside the back gate at RAF Woodbridge. Thinking an aircraft might have crashed or been forced down, they called for permission to go outside the gate to investigate. The on-duty flight chief responded and allowed 3 patrolmen to proceed on foot. The individuals reported seeing a strange glowing object in the forest. The object was described as being metallic in appearance and triangular in shape, approximately 2 to 3 metres across the base and approximately 2 metres high. It illuminated the entire forest with a white light. The object itself had a pulsing red light on top and a bank of blue lights underneath. The object was hovering or on legs. As the patrolman approached the object, it manoeuvred through the trees and disappeared. At this time, the animals on a nearby farm went into a frenzy. The object was briefly sighted approximately an hour later near the back gate. Paragraph 2. The next day, 3 depressions, half an inch deep and 7 inches in diameter, were found where the object had been sighted on the ground. The following night, that's the 29th...
Can I just interrupt? Sorry. Is it... my letter reads 1.5 inches deep, and that was what Phil told me 2 nights ago.
Yes, sorry. It's the photocopy.
Sorry, I'm not trying to...
You are correct. This is a poor photocopy, and it is actually 1.5 inches. The following night, 29th of December, the area was checked for radiation. Beta gamma readings of 0.1 milliröntgens were recorded, with peak readings in the 3 depressions and near the centre of the triangle formed by the depressions. A nearby tree had moderate, that's 0.05 to 0.07 readings, on the side of the tree toward the depressions. Paragraph 3. Later in the night, a red sun-like light was seen through the trees. It moved about and pulsed. At one point it appeared to throw off glowing particles and then broke into 5 separate white objects and then disappeared. Immediately thereafter, 3 star-like objects were noticed in the sky, 2 objects to the north and 1 to the south, all of which were about 10 degrees off the horizon. The objects moved rapidly in sharp angular movements and displayed red, green and blue lights. The objects to the north appeared to be elliptical through 8x12 power lens, and they then turned to full circles. The objects to the north remained in the sky for an hour or more. The object to the south was visible for 2 or 3 hours and beamed down a stream of light from time to time. Numerous individuals, including the undersigned, witnessed the activities in paragraphs 2 and 3. That means that Colonel Holt is claiming to have been a direct witness to the second incident as described on the second night, and also to the discovery of the traces and the measuring of the radiation readings in their vicinity. I'll not discuss it, but that's one of the sketches by one of the witnesses of what was supposedly seen. Obviously, you can see the potential significance of that letter. What is interesting, though, is that, and Brenda and Dot will correct me if I'm wrong here, but I don't think I am, until the discovery of this letter through the Freedom of Information Act, Colonel Holt's name had never materialised. So far as the investigations were concerned in the area, nobody knew that Colonel Holt had been witness to any of this. And nobody knew specifically, although we had reason to suggest this, that we were dealing with 2 separate sightings. And as later events seem to suggest, the second sighting involves actually more witnesses than the first sighting did. We're only talking about 3 security patrol officers in the first case and a lot of people in the second case. It does seem odd that it's the first case that we knew about and the second case that we didn't. But that's just one of the many puzzling questions that remain to be answered about this particular case. Anyway, that they have continued in America to pursue the Freedom of Information line following this particular document, and because from several sources, people who were involved, who talked to Brenda and Dot and so on, and Brenda and Dot themselves, as they'll tell you, because they've now actually been on the base and spoken to Colonel Holt, they know that there are other documents there, the base now. There are the original statements from all the patrolmen, statements from other witnesses who were involved, sketches and so on and so forth, of dossier relating to these events. So in lieu of that, and because also there are a number of indications that there were both movie films and sound recordings taken as the events happened, through the Freedom of Information Act, a specific request was filed in September of this year to Colonel Holt, asking for the release under that Act of all documents in his possession and tapes and films, etc. The reply to that came from, not from Colonel Holt, but from the base commander, a Colonel Cochrane, who was in charge at the base. And he flatly denied that they had any records, documents, tapes, films at all. Now, that's a problem because, as people here tonight will tell you, that patently isn't true, and it is very unusual for anybody in the US government to lie under the Freedom of Information Act. The problem remains as to how one proves that they have lied, but they evidently have lied, which means that we have to find a way of obtaining this documentation if we're going to hope to understand what really happened in this particular case.
Could I ask a question? Is it not possible that knowing this question was underway, the documents were hastily shipped off of that station? So a truthful statement could be made that they did not hold such documents.
That is, I suppose, possible. I'm not quite sure of the chronology. Maybe when the others come down, they will tell you as to whether or not when this letter was replied to in September of this year, anybody has since actually seen these documents on the base. I'm not sure about that, so I won't comment on that. I'll leave that to the others. As you can understand from what I've said so far, and I don't want to take too much longer because there's a lot of people want to talk, this is a very complicated case, and everything that we have done to try to get to the bottom of it has not made it easier to understand, but in many senses more difficult to understand. Certainly Brenda and Dot have put an awful lot of work into this, a great deal of work, and spent an awful lot of their own money on this. I mean, they have to be applauded for the tenacity of that. But we still don't know what happened. We still have numerous questions that remain to be answered, which maybe, hopefully tonight, some of them we might find a way to actually answer them. Obviously what's important, and as will come out later in the evening from particularly when Ian talks, the question of the dates, as you've just heard them, are very important. You've seen from what I've read out that Colonel Holt claims that the first incident happened on the 27th of December in the early hours, the second incident late on the night of the 29th into the early hours of December the 30th. That certainly correlates with the radar story, and the dates 27th and the 30th correlate with everything that Brenda and Dot were told by all of their witnesses. No other dates have ever cropped up, except for the fact, as you remember, that the American witness said that there were 8 sightings or contacts or radar trackings or whatever. Now, whether he means 8 different ones on those 2 separate nights or whether there are other nights that we don't know about is not sure. Certainly some information that has been gathered in America, where they've managed to track down some other witnesses, indicates that even this second sighting on the night of the 29th and the 30th was not the last one, that there were subsequent sightings in days following that. So that might explain the problems that still exist in the sense of question of the dates. But certainly the question of dates is going to crop up again tonight. But bear in mind that the dates as we have them are the 27th and the 29th. Well, what do we make of all this? I mean, what is the truth? We certainly don't know. I mean, now that the story has appeared in the British media, with the great parade of information, and in fact I will call later on the journalist who is responsible for the story appearing on the front page of the News of the World. I'm sure you'll agree it's probably the biggest splash a UFO story has ever got in this country. And he's here tonight, and he himself did an on-the-site investigation for almost a fortnight, following up this case, checking up all the leads that he could find in the area. So he's got things to contribute, and I'll ask him to say a few words afterwards. But since it's appeared in there, of course, it's spread around the world, and everybody is now talking about it. But we still don't know what the truth is. I mean, it's been presented in the context of it was an alien contact, and what Art Wallace said is what actually happened. But we don't know that what Art Wallace said is what actually happened, because in many respects, as you must have noticed, Art Wallace's story and the other stories that we got from the radar operators and the people who talked to Brenda and Dot about aliens suspended in beams of light underneath the craft talking to the base commander flatly contradict the report from Colonel Holt, which in many senses actually does correlate with the story. There are elements within here that fit what we've been told, but there are a great many things in here that are not in here that are in all these other testimonies. So, you know, who is right? Are all the witnesses who've spoken to us before fabricating, elaborating, fantasizing, or what? Or is this the truth? Or is it not the truth? Is this a diluted version of the truth? As you see, we still have numerous problems. We've tossed all kinds of different situations around over the past 3 years. We've debated this case endlessly. As Dot will testify, and as anybody else who's involved in this investigation will testify, our phone bills have been like that for the last 2 or 3 years, and you know, there doesn't seem to be any end to it. We're talking incessantly, trying to figure out what is going on, because that's all we're interested in, getting to the truth of what happened. Is it possible that somehow there was some sort of an experiment that went on, and that they're using the UFO story as a cover for that? Did something go wrong? There have been suggestions, for example, that maybe a missile went out of control and almost exploded, and the UFO story was invented as a cover for that. And do you find that plausible? There are problems with it, I assure you, but who knows? Did the UFO contact with the aliens happen, and has this watered down version, or even the second sighting itself, been sort of seeded out to us as a means of actually deflecting us away from the original story involving the aliens, hoping that we'll believe this is the truth and forget about the rest? Was that a fantasy? Has it just got everybody on the base just gone mad and started talking about it and yabbered away about aliens and silver suits and what have you, and that's come out as the truth, when the real truth is only this? It's just an incredible exaggeration of the truth. If that's so, we have the problem that the story about the aliens and the silver suits and all the rest of it, the strange features, came to the radar operators immediately. That is, within 2 or 3 days of this happening. The story that came out through the original witness to Brenda and Dot came out immediately within 2 or 3 days and said the same thing. If it was a rumour that just spread and got exaggerated, it happened very, very fast. And it's odd that the original stories are the strangest ones, and the ones that have come later are not more strange but less strange. That seems to be contrary to what you might expect, but who knows? And of course, the principal fact of the matter is, whatever the explanation for this, that here we have apparently 2 incidents at least which involve many witnesses, military people, some of high rank, like Lieutenant Colonel Holt, civilians too, who were outside the area looking in and saw things going on, animal disturbance of various kinds, including farm animals that were disturbed and so on, the apparent traces in a symmetrical formation in the forest clearing where the event happened, the radiation, and official acknowledgement both from our own Ministry of Defence and from the US Air Force that the incident happened, which is a bit of a breakthrough, and official acknowledgement from our Ministry of Defence that the event is unexplained, which is again a strange thing. So that on its own makes this case worth some study and some follow-up and some investigation, which is why we have persisted to chase it as we have. But unravelling it is still a problem. I think at that point, the first person I'll call down to sort of add some light to, well, I'll call down both Brenda and Dot, if you like, if you want to both come down and chip in your personal knowledge. Whilst they're coming down, in fact, it might be an idea if we show the movie film that we've got of the area so you can have a general idea of what things look like there. If you... Right, don't applaud. You can applaud if we solve the case. I'll let Brenda and Dot explain what you're seeing on the screen, if you want to do so. Okay, go on. Go on.
That is the actual supposed area, Rendlesham Forest. Just behind my daughter is towards the field there, and in the middle is where the field is, where it's craft and the cows were. I'm sorry, I'm an amateur with all this, so I'm sorry about that. The area where the children are is where this thing was supposed to have come down. It was thought at first that it could have been the forest logs that were put on there, but I've checked it out, and apparently the logs are not put in the middle of the site, they are put on the side. This is recently of the site. They've dug it, funny enough, they've dug it all up. Why? Just out of the news, the world thing decided to dig it up.
To plant baby trees.
Yes, they do.
They...
At the top part, they are eventually putting some new ones there.
Yeah.
So there could be a perfectly good reason as to why they're digging it up.
But isn't it normal to leave the tree stumps to rot before they replant an area?
Yes, they are. There were tree stumps there. There has been for about the last 3 years. So the trees were felled.
But there's been no actual digging up that area then?
Only just recently, in the last month or so. Just up. This is still the area.
If there's anything that you and Brenda want to add to what's been said that you think are important points that you should bring out, will you do so now? While you've got the chance.
Can I just run through now?
Well, yes, I mean, you can comment.
This is Woodbridge Runway. Over the back there is where some of the lights were seen in the forest at the back, which is to the side of Woodbridge. And apparently this is where the person on the East Gate first saw the lights. This is information I've recently gained.
So is this filmed from the gate?
This is going west towards the East Gate. In a moment you'll see where the East Gate is. Well, it's right at the back. These are the hangars on Woodbridge. This is up towards this corner here is where the East Gate is itself.
So they'll be looking out from the film towards you, to that area of forest you saw before.
In a moment you'll see the road that leads down to the East Gate.
Doc, can you see the lighthouse from that gate on the base?
Well, you can't from the East Gate, no, because the contours of the land from the East Gate itself you can't. That road to the left leads to the Forestry Commission, and obviously the one that was on the right there is towards the East Gate. That was my lift. Going back on the site. Yeah, that's facing east to south.
Forgive me, how do you know it's a site?
It's what the witnesses and plus the forestry people have told us. This is the flight line on Bentwaters. The things where that lorry's just passed are the light halls that have been mentioned in Art Wallace's statement. Also in this particular area is where the underground complex is supposed to be, where there's supposed to be some form of craft there.
I'm sorry, how would the Forestry Commission themselves know where the site was?
And they had two chaps that visited them, I believe it's the day after,
Yes.
on the 1st of January. And these two chaps showed the forestry people where it was supposed to come down.
Who
We
were
still can't
the
find out.
two chaps? Who were the two chaps?
We're still trying to find out who they were. We just don't know. We've drawn a blank on that.
Were they
They also went round to farmers and people there and interviewed them as well.
Were they British or American?
Yeah, they're British.
They were British, which is a problem because the British authorities are not supposed to have been involved at that time because Colonel Holt's letter to the MOD is dated the 13th of January, remember. But you have the problem also, bear in mind, that the radar tapes were taken away from the RAF base prior to Holt's letter being sent to the MOD, and the MOD assure us that they could not, the US Air Force could not take radar tapes from an RAF base without MOD permission and therefore knowledge, presumably, of why the tapes were being taken away.
Sorry, have you got independent verification of this story about the radar tapes?
Independent verification from where?
Well, what is your source of that? One,
Well, I explained right at the beginning what the source was, and also that the
did
radar...
you check you worked at the radar station?
Yes, we checked with the radar station itself, denied it. But subsequently, in having...
Say that there is the house on the edge of the field that was supposed to have glowed red.
Subsequent to having obtained Colonel Holt's document, we took it along to the Ministry of Defence and challenged them on a number of points in relation to it.
That is the field where the cattle were supposed to have contacted the crowds. And it's supposed to have gone along here. Again, there's the house that's supposed to be involved. The chap in charge of the cattle lived on the left side of the house there. Left half, because it's like semi-detached.
Could you just say what you were going to say about the underground thing?
Underground complex.
Yeah.
Well, Art Wallace has come up with that he was taken down to an underground complex where he was briefed on what to say and what not to say. He has said that there was a craft down there, an alien craft, which obviously we've still got an open mind about that. All this is being checked out, plus the underground complex. We do know there is one there. We've had this confirmed by several people, and including a chap that helped build it. So we do know it exists. Obviously, as regards an alien craft down there, it's going to be checked out. It obviously sounds a cool story, but it's all part of the investigation.
Do we know why Art Wallace is no longer in the American Air Force?
Yes, he apparently was given duties that he wasn't supposed to have done. And through this he requested his release out of the Air Force, which he was duly given.
Can we be certain that it wasn't on medical grounds?
Lawrence Fawcett in the States has got documents proving that he was released.
His discharge papers have been seen.
Yeah.
It's been seen, right?
Yeah.
Couldn't we go back a stage to the radar station? Do we know the name of the radar station?
Yes, the radar station was Watton.
It's what?
Yeah.
Watton?
Watton. So I believe, yes.
This is the Columbia going up. In a second, you'll see a double line.
Interesting.
Obviously, you're going to chase it Rendlesham UFO probably. In a second, you'll see a double line come up. Should do. And it's actually the boom that you get as that gets so far up. You get a sound barrier, and which did shake the ground a bit. It's a bit show, isn't it?
Explain that that's the most recent launching last week. The week before
Yeah,
that.
this is the one that just landed the other night. We was fortunate, Jenny and I was fortunate to go down and see it go. Oh, it must be a bit of
Yeah, on the radar, Arnold, I'll just point out that it's a totally unconfirmed story, except that this person, remember, who originally told us about it, claims not to have been there himself and only heard it from sources on the base. The base themselves will not confirm it, but we have since, through the Ministry of Defence, got them to admit that radar tapes were taken from Watton and several other bases in East Anglia to check for targets that might correlate with this incident. But they claim that none of the radar tapes did provide a correlating target. So that's the situation as it stands. Is there anything significant you two want to add? Because we are being pushed for time.
It's quite a few, obviously, it's got to be cut down short. The one thing with Art Wallace, while I was in the States, I did manage to see him and interview him. And yeah, there is some discrepancies in what he said. But then again, some things have got to be checked out. One particular thing he came out with that only Brenda, Butler and myself knew was other areas as to where these lights were seen. And while I showed him a map of the area, he did confirm these other areas to me, which, as I say, Brenda and I were the only ones that knew about. These other lights we got from one particular base personnel member and also members of the public, which there were several of. And also this particular area is where the underground complex is supposed to be. Obviously that's still being checked out. But as I said with the film, also to the left of the East Gate, the lights were seen in that area as well, and also by a gravel pit. This also was confirmed to us by Colonel Holt, regardless of Art Wallace as well. One point I'd like to bring up as regards the other area is I've had somebody go down and check this out, and on the area which is nearest to Bentwaters, where the lights were first seen, is in dense forests, and I'd just like to add there is no way can the lighthouse be seen. Also in part of the area off the East Gate it can't be seen, and as I said, from the East Gate itself.
Well, Doc, I think we're going slightly ahead of ourselves there. I think at this point, I'm
trying to do it.
Yeah, okay. I'll just ask Harry if you've got anything that you want to add about your involvement in this case. I'll point out why Harry Harris is going to make comments. Harry Harris first got involved about 18 months ago, is that right, when he spoke to the original witness that Brenda and Dot turned up. And the witness confirmed to Harry basically what he had already told Brenda and Dot. So it was a sort of third party checking out on the basic facts. And since that time, Harry has played a small role in the investigations, and I'll leave him to describe what he wants to.
Yes. Firstly, can I just clarify a few misconceptions? I don't subscribe to any paranormal or mystical theory. Something can happen, it's not paranormal. It may be we don't understand what it is, but once we do understand it, perhaps it ceases to be paranormal. The second point is that the evidence that I've come across, I have no means of testing it. It might be a tissue of lies, it might be genuine. The third point, and here I have to be very, very careful as to what I say. My two colleagues and myself, Mike Sachs and Detective Chief Inspector Norman Collins, have been, or have had access to certain material, evidence if you like, well it is evidence, relating to this incident in circumstances under which I had to give a solicitor's undertaking, and I am a solicitor, I'm not advertising, but I am a solicitor. And we had to give this undertaking of confidentiality as the source of the evidence and in relation to the evidence itself. You'll just have to take my word for that, because I'm not going to tell you what that information or evidence was, but I ask you to take my word for it. The evidence, so far as I can comment on it, supports the theory that an unidentified flying object of unknown origin landed in the woods somewhere at the end of December on probably 2 occasions. If this evidence is bogus, then it might well be bogus because we have had no opportunity of testing it. And I must stress that. We have no opportunity of testing it. We were confronted with it through circumstances which I won't go into, I can't go into. We were very lucky to have it made available to us. But it was made available to us. And either this evidence was cleverly, very, very cleverly contrived and totally bogus, or it's genuine. I don't know which. If it was bogus, a lot of people, and I say a lot of people, went to an awful lot of trouble to concoct it. And one may ask, what is their motive? I don't know. It could be bogus, it could be an absolute load of rubbish. I don't know. On the other hand, it could be genuine.
What do you plan to do with it?
I cannot do anything with it. I haven't even got it to do anything with, and I'm not free to do anything with it. I cannot tell you. I'm sorry. You'll have to take my word for that. The evidence exists. Whether it is genuine or not, I do not know.
Perhaps we better move on from that point, Harry.
But if we can't hear it, it could be a load of funk.
Well, Robin, I have just said it may be a load of funk.
Can I just state something?
Nothing could be that secret.
I'm sorry.
Can I just state something? Both Brenda and I, when we got Colonel Holt's report, we tried to get to see Colonel Holt, but sadly he was on holiday. So we went to see Squadron Leader Morland. When we got into his office, he was totally surprised by the document that we got, and we showed him. He says, "Oh, you know, the Ministry of Defence have sent it to you," which they didn't. It came from America. He said, "Oh, well, then I can talk." And he stated that Colonel Holt had come to him and said, well, and told him the whole story, and said, "Well, what shall I do with it?" Squadron Morland then turned around and said, "Do a brief report," which is that. And Squadron Leader Morland said he would send that down to Ministry of Defence. We questioned him further, and all of a sudden he picked up his phone to his secretary and said, I believe her name was Betty or something.
Penny.
Was it Penny?
Yeah.
"Oh, Penny, can you bring in the UFO file?" You know, and they're not supposed to have anything to do with UFOs on the base or anything. He did quote quickly, "Well, we don't actually have a UFO file." Hence his secretary brought this in, and it was in a fold about the size of that, like a book, but thicker. It's about as thick as that. And he went through. Obviously, I tried my damnedest to find out what the rest of the other papers were, and he was curious of me watching him. But he did bring out the original letter of Holt's report, which he showed us.
Robin, you say a load of rubbish. Now, with respect, you've just seen a film now.
Okay.
Now, you have to take the word of Brenda and Doc. That is a film of Rendlesham Forest.
Oh, yes,
It can be a film of anywhere. You cannot prove it or disprove it. And that is the point I'm making. The evidence that I and Mike and Norman have been confronted with, we do not know if it is genuine or if it is bogus. All we can say is, if it is bogus, it was cleverly contrived, and one may ask what is the motive for producing such evidence.
Can I ask you one question? Is it material, documentary, or what? Are you able
I'm
to
not
say?
answering, Jenny.
All right.
Suffice it to say,
Can we move on then?
Yes,
I'll bring
no,
you.
just let me. Can I please finish?
Tell you.
Harry,
Can I just the answer to that, I do not know. We made contact with a witness, or a series of witnesses. There were two, in fact, who we never expected to make contact with.
Can I ask you?
Please let me finish. Now, can I just move on to other things? I have had...
Harry, I'll bring you back in later, but we've got to move on because we've got a lot to get through. Can I just...
No, just one thing. Just very, very briefly.
What's it
I've had
about?
a series of conversations with Colonel Hope. The last time I spoke to him was last Thursday evening of this week.
Yes, well, can I bring you back
Yes,
on that?
all right,
Because I
yes,
specifically
I'm sorry,
want
yes.
to ask you about that subsequent to
Yes,
something
yes,
else. So
yes.
please leave that for now. Keith, is there anything that you'd like to state fairly briefly, if there's anything you think you should add at this point?
Yes, I would. And I'd like to thank you for allowing me to attend approached this story, the news of the world, with a completely open mind. I neither believed nor disbelieved in flying saucers, UFOs, little green men, call them what you will. But I have no doubt at all that an incident occurred on the dates that are placed in Colonel Holt's report, a copy of which I have here. I have no doubt at all that that is an absolutely genuine document. I've checked that out. It's been checked out with the Ministry of Defence. It's been checked out in America. Something occurred on those dates, and I think the accurate version of what occurred at that time has still to be published. What we published is the story so far, and there is yet a lot more to come out. I've no doubt at all that Colonel Holt has got an awful lot more information. He was surprised to see me and a little concerned. He agreed that there was a lot more information and suggested that if an arrangement could be made whereby a contribution made towards his children's school fees, he may be in a position to release a little more information. We could reach agreement on that point. He then, it was made absolutely clear to him, in fact, that he dare not say any more as a result of his position in the United States Air Force. The people I have seen, I do not doubt at all that they're telling the truth, which is very important from our point of view, because we could be held up to an awful lot of ridicule. Attempts have been made to